In the 1960s, this mysterious disappearance made headlines of newspapers worldwide and became the subject of numerous books and documentaries. After all, it's not every day that the heir to the greatest fortune on earth disappears in a jungle inhabited by primitive tribes. But a solution to this mystery proved to be too difficult. Today's story touches on two themes, combining an incident in the wilderness and a criminal case. It is also closely connected to the history of several countries at once. While preparing this video, I tried my best to fit all the information into half an hour, but this case is so voluminous that I ended up having to omit many moments. There have been documentaries made about this story, several books written about it, as well as numerous articles and podcasts of all kinds. It's impossible to cover everything there is to this story, so I'll leave the links to more detailed sources in the description so you can dive even deeper on your own. If this isn't the first time you've watched my videos, please consider subscribing and turning on the bell notifications so that you don't miss any new stories. Today, we'll be traveling to the island of New Guinea. But before we proceed to New Guinea, let's first meet the traveler whose trip we'll be discussing today. And even if you've never heard about him, you've definitely heard of his family. Michael Clark Rockefeller was born on May 18, 1938, into such a famous and rich family that their name has become pretty much synonymous to luxury and wealth. The Rockefellers were and still are the owners of one of the largest fortunes in the United States. Back in the 19th century, a man named John Rockefeller, at the time not even a high school graduate, began searching for oil and co-founded the Standard Oil Company. The venture was enormously successful, and soon Rockefeller earned the proud title of America's first billionaire. The money John made was passed on to his children, and then to his children's children, who, contrary to what often happens with inheritances, only increased the Rockefellers' fortune. Nelson Rockefeller, John's grandson and the father of Michael Rockefeller, was born in 1908 and from an early age dreamed of becoming a politician. Later in life, he became the Republican governor of New York, having earned eager support since the Rockefeller family brought fame and money to all who were close. In the early days of his career, Nelson Rockefeller really did his best to benefit those who elected him, but then, as it often happens, he became mired in corruption and scandals. This, however, did not prevent him from becoming vice president in the Gerald Ford administration in 1974. With his first wife, Mary Clark Rockefeller, Nelson had 5 children: Rodman, Ann, Stephen, and twins Mary and Michael. At the time, the family had a fortune of about $900 million, which is the equivalent of billions, possibly even tens of billions of dollars today. Nelson's children, like Nelson himself, were born with silver spoons in their mouths. They were given the best education. Michael first attended the private Buckley School in New York, and then graduated from the Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire. Michael seemed to excel at everything. He engaged in sports and arts, and was even head of the student parliament. He was especially enamored with the arts, enjoyed making yearbooks with photos of his fellow students, and himself dabbled in photography. As for university, he naturally went to Harvard, where he earned degrees in history and economics. Afterwards, he spent 6 months in the army, and his family expected him to then take his place in the Rockefeller business empire, taking up a top position to manage the family's multi-million-dollar fortune like his father and grandfather before him. However, Michael didn't desire such a future for himself. He dreamed of adventure, of something fascinating and breathtaking. He wasn't interested in some boring office job. This was when an idea came to him. In 1929, Michael's grandmother Abby founded in New York a museum of modern art, which we now know as MoMA. The museum's first director was her son Nelson Rockefeller, in whom Abby had instilled a love for culture and art from a very early age. Nelson, however, was more interested in another type of art than the classics, what was known at the time as primitive art. The MoMA website explains to the modern reader that the term primitive was used in the 1800s to refer to Italian and Flemish art of the 14th and 15th centuries, which was seen as simple, honest, and expressive by artists in the 19th century. Later on, the use of the term broadened, and it began referring to all art of ancient and indigenous cultures from South America to Southeast Asia. And it was at the time when Michael, like his father, began developing an interest in art that the term primitive started being associated with wooden masks and assorted sculptures of tribes in Africa and on different islands. By the end of the 20th century, the word primitive fell out of use in relation to art because it was deemed too condescending and pejorative. Back in the day, Nelson offered MoMA to create an exhibition of primitive art, but his offer was rejected. So the wealthy heir to the Rockefellers' fortune decided to found his own museum of primitive art where he could do what he wanted. The new museum was opened right across the street from MoMA. Nelson Rockefeller adored art objects from so-called primitive cultures. His interest, however, was purely aesthetic. He himself said that it didn't matter to him what the indigenous peoples used those objects for. He was only interested in how they looked and not in the fact that they were an important part of indigenous culture, rituals, rites, and festivities. And it was the mixture of love for art and ignorance of the artifact's true purpose that Nelson instilled in his children, including Michael. Michael really wanted his parents to be proud of him, so it was because he knew of his father's love for primitive cultures that Michael contacted Robert Gardner from Harvard and asked to participate in the filming of a documentary about the mysterious island of New Guinea and its people. New Guinea is the second largest island in the world, discovered by Portuguese mariners in the 16th century. In 1824, the western half of the island, which is the one we'll be talking about today, was occupied by the Dutch. New Guinea was also colonized by the British, Germans, Australians, and the Japanese, but we won't be discussing them in detail. European colonizers brought the first iron weapons to the island, and tobacco, which the indigenous Papuans and Melanesians really liked. These peoples had inhabited these areas for centuries, if not for millennia, were accustomed to the climate, and for the most part lived in the Stone Age. They had never seen white people, weren't aware of their customs, clothes, and ships. Before the 16th century, they didn't even know other people existed in the world, and to them, white people were literally aliens. With a few exceptions, the white people in New Guinea behaved peacefully, and many locals managed to get along with them. The local tribes subsisted on fishing, hunting, gathering, growing sweet potatoes, and keeping pigs. Naturally, after Europeans discovered New Guinea, white missionaries set out for the island to proselytize, but it was rather difficult to change the beliefs of the tribes. Even today, many members of the more remote tribes continue believing in their own gods and spirits to whom they devote their lives. Attempts to convince them that the Christian God is better were mostly unsuccessful. Robert Gardner, who was making the documentary, was interested in studying the Dani tribe, which inhabited the mountainous, forest-covered areas of western New Guinea. Dani were a more developed tribe. Since they lived in the mountains, they managed to grow cereals and keep animals, while the tribes living along rivers didn't have this opportunity due to high humidity and flooding. In general, Gardner's idea for the film was a bit bizarre. He wanted his documentary on the Dani to be a study of how bloodthirsty and aggressive people can be. The indigenous tribes of New Guinea were constantly at war with each other, with villages always avenging the murder of their own in accordance with the principle that each death must be repaid. Even though the Dutch authorities claimed that the Dani tribe had already given up their tradition of bloodshed, it seems that in reality this wasn't the case. Gardner's film shows actual battles between the villages, casualties included. Michael and Robert set out for the jungle of western New Guinea in April 1961. The young Rockefeller was only 23 years old at the time, and the reason for him traveling halfway across the globe was not only filming. His father had tasked him with collecting as many primitive art objects as possible. Here's what Michael said about the upcoming trip. It's the desire to do something adventurous at a time when frontiers, in the real sense of the word, are disappearing. The Dutch authorities provided financial support for the filming. They encouraged the project, finding it to be an excellent opportunity to show the world that everything was going well in their colony. Gardner called his film Dead Birds and made Michael, who had never held a recording device in his hands before, responsible for the sound. Of course, it wasn't merely by chance that the young Rockefeller joined the expedition. Gardner hoped that the famous name would bring even more money into his project. On April 2, 1961, Michael was on board a small aircraft flying over the Baliem Valley, which was where the filming for Dead Birds was supposed to start. The Baliem is a thing of magnificent vastness, decorated with the green of the valley floor and blues of the surrounding mountains. Tones are ever-changing in the shifting light. The mountains rise over 10,000 feet on all sides and are constantly hidden, altered by the clouds that gather above them. The valley floor is broken into fragments by the Baliem distributaries, hills and rocky rises, and the handmade barriers of the Dani peoples. The climate is like Maine in the peak of summer, only the sun is better. Michael compared the climate of New Guinea with that of the state of Maine, since he hadn't really traveled anywhere else before except around North America. Of course, in actual fact, the climate here was starkly different. The young Rockefeller had arrived at the heart of the tropics. In the valley, Michael met the whole team, which included Robert Gardner, who was the director, writer Peter Matheson, Life magazine photographer Elliot Elisifon, and anthropologist Jan Broekhuis. The men had arrived to study the ways of the peoples of the Guinean jungle, having taken a few locals with them as assistants and interpreters. The group made camp in the forest, trying not to bother the locals, but the locals soon came to them themselves, having been drawn to the filming equipment and the white man. Soon, filming started. Dead Birds pays a lot of attention to the way death is woven into the tribe's everyday life, death and war. Every day, the Dani tribe waits for the enemy to attack, but not during rain or dusk, for the rain will wet the feathers that adorn the warriors' heads, while at dusk, even the bravest warrior may fall victim to the spirits that roam through the village at night. When the enemy does attack, all men armed with bows and arrows run to counterattack. Meanwhile, the women and children continue going about their daily chores, herding swine, soaking bark in the river. The battle will continue until the first death, which will mean that the attacking enemy will consider themselves avenged, or until dusk, or indeed until the warriors become tired and decide to take a timeout. These scenes, of course, were filmed from a safe distance, since nobody on the team wanted to be hit by an arrow with a jagged tip that breaks off once lodged inside flesh. During filming, Michael Rockefeller didn't do his job of recording sound particularly eagerly. He rather preferred taking pictures of the tribe's people, observing their customs and daily life. Michael was undoubtedly talented, but Gardner didn't like this attitude of his, and even at some point scolded him for not engaging in the recording of sound as he was supposed to. However, as we remember, Michael had another mission besides recording sound, procuring as many artifacts as possible. While on the island, Michael found out that the members of the Asmat tribe, which lived closer to the coast, were excellent woodcarvers, and naturally, he immediately desired to buy some wooden figurines from them for his collection. The Asmat territory was also located in western New Guinea and controlled by the Dutch authorities. The Asmat lived in pole houses because the coastal territories become flooded during strong tides, when the water and the impassable jungle became practically inseparable from each other. The water flows deep into the forest, and surviving in such territory is quite the challenge. The Asmat are very dependent on wood, and believe that the first human was made of it, which is why their carvings are so elaborate. Asmats subsist mainly on fish and a grain called sorghum. Their chief means of transportation are long canoes, the only way of getting from one village to another. Another interesting fact about the Asmat is that for centuries they practiced headhunting, a term that is pretty self-explanatory. The Western authorities intended to put an end to such a bloody practice, but it seems they weren't too successful in this campaign. In general, the Asmat tribes practice a lot of things that Westerners would often consider barbaric, like polygamy. Especially their sex-based rituals greatly astonished white travelers. Asmats believe that everything in their life is controlled by spirits. If somebody died of an illness or was killed, the spirits were to blame. If something good happened, once again, it must have been the spirits. The most evil spirits were those of warriors killed by enemy tribes. These had to be revered and each death avenged. And the revenge had to be of equal value, a life for a life. Let's dwell on the topic of headhunting a little longer. The Asmat believed a human head to be like the fruit of a tree, their most important part. Headhunting was part of the ritual of male initiation, and the Asmat even have a legend that includes instructions on how to correctly carve a body. The ritual would begin in a large house known as a ewe, where a young man who hadn't yet been initiated lived, while the elders gathered there to discuss the villagers' problems. For the ritual of initiation, warriors of one village would get together and go to the neighboring village, where they would choose a suitable victim. They attacked him and separated the head from the body. Then, on their canoes, they returned to their village, where they took part in a long and horrifying ritual involving the consumption of parts of the victim. Then, the boy who was now becoming a man took the name of the victim for himself, and the relatives of the victim in the neighboring village would from now consider the initiated to be their brother and have no right to attack him. These people often became negotiators during conflict, since they could tread freely on enemy territory. According to some sources, headhunting in these areas continues even today, but much more rarely. In 1961, however, the practice was still quite common, and the Dutch authorities would often turn a blind eye to it provided it wasn't done too openly. But let's get back to dead birds. There was finally a pause in the filming process, which gave Michael an excellent opportunity to travel to the Asmat territories. The Dutch authorities greatly encouraged Michael's interest in the Asmat and assigned anthropologist René Wassing to him so that he would help the young heir. However, René had never been in the Asmat villages, having made his whole career at an office table. Nonetheless, on June 22, 1961, Michael and René arrived at Pirimapun, a small village also under control of the Dutch authorities. It was on Asmat territory, but still considered civilized, with noticeable Western influence. The Asmats had already come into contact with white people quite extensively at this point, mostly with European missionaries who lived among the locals and learned their language in order to form a connection with them, often becoming the best experts as far as communication with Asmats went. The tribe was amicable towards white people and didn't consider them to be targets for headhunting. Why so? Keep in mind that according to the beliefs of the Asmat, any death, especially that of a warrior, must be avenged. You cannot simply kill somebody with impunity. His relatives from the neighboring village will come after you with spears. But what sort of revenge can one expect from white people? What if the gods themselves become enraged by the fact that the Asmat killed an outsider? This is why the tribes living along the river didn't harass the European settlers and would even let them inside their homes. One of such people was a missionary named Cornelius van Kessel, who lived with the tribes and learned their language. Michael Rockefeller, however, didn't like the fact that the Asmat villages were well acquainted with Europeans and treated them either with disinterest or with a slight curiosity. He was especially astounded by the fact that many Asmats wore Western clothing. He found this to mean that the West had already had the chance to influence and distort even such remote areas of the globe. Nonetheless, he used this fact to his advantage and started exchanging Western clothing and other amenities of the civilized world for Asmat art. However, Michael didn't at all understand what these wooden artifacts meant for the locals. He was especially impressed by ancestor poles, which each village erected for those who had been killed during headhunting. It was believed that the spirits of murdered ancestors inhabited these poles, unable to find peace until they were avenged. Michael found the poles to be very exotic and decided to buy up as many of them as he could. According to some sources, Michael was also interested in other headhunting-related artifacts, including the heads themselves, which the warriors usually kept for themselves. Michael's visit to the Asmat territories created quite the stir among the locals. He offered a whopping 10 iron instruments for each head, and the Asmats, who by this time had given up regular headhunting, even asked the Dutch government to allow them to hunt specifically for this occasion. The authorities naturally rejected the tribe's plea and chided Michael for creating an unhealthy relationship between supply and demand. In one of the villages, Michael managed to procure 4 ceremonial poles, They stood deep in the woods and spirits living in them had already been avenged, so the villagers agreed to part with them. However, it wasn't enough for Michael to just buy the old poles. He demanded that the locals perform a ritual around them that he would film. Whether it was for fun or whether Michael really didn't understand the local customs, we don't know. For a good fee, however, the tribesmen agreed to perform a dance around the poles and then let the young heir take them for himself. Michael wasn't happy with the dance though, saying that the villagers had done it without heart and didn't put enough effort into it. Afterwards, Michael continued voyaging from village to village, buying up everything he could and seeking out new poles. Everything was going well. In the remote village of Utsjanap, he found 7 ceremonial poles of unparalleled beauty. However, they stood right in the center of the village, which could only mean one thing: the spirits inhabiting them still hadn't been avenged. Michael wasn't aware whose spirits those were, even though the events that had happened in the village only a few years earlier could affect his own future. On February 8, 1958, several boats with white soldiers led by Dutchman Max Lepre set out for Utsjanap. They found out that Utsjanap was still at war with a neighboring village and wanted to teach them a lesson. Max Lepre, who had his own reasons for disrespecting the indigenous population, opened fire in the village, burned their canoes and their ewe, the large house where the village elders met to discuss daily problems. Such violence from the colonizers became possible because at the time, the fate of New Guinea was being decided on a much higher level. Among the contenders for control over the island were the Netherlands, Great Britain, and Indonesia, as well as other Asian countries. The USA also had an agenda in the region. They feared that Indonesia might go the way of several other Asian countries and become a communist state. Next year, the Utsjanap village erected 7 poles in memory of those killed that day, as a reminder that they are yet to be avenged. In Asmat culture, revenge doesn't have a time limit. They can wait for years and years. It was these poles that caught Michael's eye. He had arranged to buy them, and the locals, after accepting his gifts, promised they would deliver the poles to him somewhat later, seeing as it was difficult for them to give them up. Michael, however, was overjoyed. Finally, he had a chance to acquire something of proper value. The young man hoped that if he brought some truly interesting artifacts back home, then his parents would let him pursue this passion of his on a regular basis instead of sitting around in some boring office job. Michael dreamed of adventures and delighted in the idea of visiting remote tribes in the search of curious artifacts. Throughout July, Michael continued working on the documentary and told his colleagues that once he was finished with it, he would definitely return to the Asmat region. Several more poles were waiting to be picked up, and so many other villages were still unexplored. In August, Michael returned to New York for some time. The filming had ended successfully, whereas at home, a scandal was brewing. It turned out that Nelson was having an affair with a married woman, 20 years his junior, who had 2 children of her own, and so he decided to leave his wife, Michael's mother. Michael spent some time at home with his parents and siblings, but he couldn't wait to get back onto the path of adventure. In September, Michael returned to New Guinea to continue his search for local art. What time is it? And where am I? It is the nighttime with crickets going berserk around me, and I'm back in Hollandia. I arrived exhausted today and found that tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Renee and I will fly to Morocco in order to make a 6 p.m. boat to the Asmat. I am now surrounded by my little reality for the next 10 weeks, a chaos of cameras and recording equipment, the cluttering of everything including my mind. The key to my fascination with the Asmat is the wood carving. The sculpture which the people here produce is some of the most extraordinary in the primitive world, and equally as remarkable as the art is the fact that the culture which produces it is still intact. Some remote areas are still headhunting, and only 5 years ago the whole area was headhunting. This time, Michael bought a proper boat for adventuring. This was a vessel made of 2 canoes with a small motor in the back. Together with anthropologist Renee Wassing, they planned to travel further to reach new villages. There was no point in waiting any longer, so Michael and Renee set out again on October 10th. after having cataloged their findings and sending some of the so-called primitive art back to America. Michael seemed to have already begun to understand the culture that permeated the island, but had only a vague notion of the place where they were heading. Michael and Renee were accompanied by 2 Asmat boys who served as translators. The river that they set out along was quite unpredictable and dangerous at this time of year. Even the Asmat themselves were wary of using these waters during certain periods. Neither Renee nor Michael had enough training to steer even such a simple boat, and Renee didn't even know how to swim. By a cruel twist of fate, on November 18th, their boat got caught up in a massive storm. Waves crashed onto the boat, filling it with water. Soon, the motor died, which meant that the men couldn't control the boat's direction anymore. The river swiftly carried them into the ocean. During the storm, the 2 Asmat boys jumped overboard and swam towards the shore, telling Michael and Renee that they were going to look for help and that the 2 should also leave the boat and swim to land. Renee, however, couldn't swim, and Michael didn't want to leave him on his own. Besides, all of their cameras and several artifacts were in the boat. Thus, Michael and Renee ended up completely alone on a half-destroyed boat among seemingly endless waves. The local boys swam ashore, and about 10 hours later, a rescue vessel set out to the spot where the boys had last seen the boat with the white man. However, the rescue boat unexpectedly ran out of fuel. On the next day, November 19th, rescuers managed to spot the traveler's boat from an airplane, which had almost sunk by this point, but they encountered an unpleasant surprise. Renee was the only one on board. Michael was nowhere to be seen. Renee told the rescuers that Michael decided not to wait for them and instead started swimming towards the shore, which at this point was still visible by himself. He was a good swimmer, but just in case, he strapped 2 gas cylinders to his belt before setting out to look for help, diving from the boat only in his trunks. The rescuers searched for Michael, but their search was incredibly difficult. They couldn't find any trace of him neither on shore nor in the village. The heir of the Rockefeller family had disappeared in the wild, impassable jungle. Having found out about his son's disappearance, Nelson Rockefeller started planning his trip to New Guinea. As early as November 19th, he wanted to organize the search operation himself. Michael's twin sister, Mary Rockefeller, asked to join her father's expedition. She was convinced that if John was going, then her brother would definitely be found alive, since her father was always a man of his word.
I began to develop my own vision. Father and I would travel together to this foreign land. We would search, and we would find Michael. I could even see him when we found him. Disheveled, valiant, and even a bit surprised at our concern. Not easily prone to worry or fear, he would have surmounted the obstacles and landed on his feet, as he always had. In a fleeting fantasy, I became the princess departing with my father, the king, to find the lost prince, soon to be reunited in twinship, as it was meant to be.
Those were the words Mary wrote about their journey to New Guinea. The plane that Mary and Nelson had boarded was packed with journalists. Nelson invited them to join him to ensure that the search for Michael stayed in the public eye. Mary, however, didn't understand why he had done that, because she had wanted to be alone, but instead she was constantly being bothered by reporters asking her about her brother. Representatives of the Dutch government were already waiting for the Rockefellers on the island. Nelson was a welcome guest in these parts. He was immediately informed that all villages were safe to visit and that no headhunting was taking place anymore. This claim, of course, was in part politically motivated. Nelson started his search immediately. He and Mary would fly around the island on a helicopter, peering down into the waters and woods, but alas, their efforts were in vain. Even if Michael did manage to swim ashore, he would have had it tough. The seawater reaches deep into the jungle, a thick forest inhabited by insects, snakes, crocodiles, and countless other deadly creatures. It was estimated that if he had made it ashore and gone through the forest, he would only have reached the settlement in 10 or 11 days. The US government offered its military vessels to help with the search, but Rockefeller refused. he wanted for people in the US to think his mission in New Guinea was under control. Many local villagers also helped in the search for Michael, combing through the forest. Only one village didn't take part in the search, one that held a grudge against white people. It approached the search with such an indifference as if nothing at all had happened. This was the village of Otsjanup, the same one where Michael had found 7 wooden poles inhabited by the unavenged souls of Asmats killed by white men. On November 24th, one of the cylinders that Michael had strapped onto himself was found. This gave Nelson hope. Perhaps if the cylinder was found, this meant that his son had reached the shore and gotten out of the water somewhere in the vicinity. However, nothing else was found except for that cylinder. At the time, many experts thought that the lost cylinder might be a sign of, say, a crocodile attack. But if that were indeed the case, they would have found both cylinders, seeing as the crocodile wouldn't have touched them. It seemed more plausible that Michael made it ashore, took one cylinder with him to use for potable water, and left the other one behind. But all of this was only guesswork. Where was Michael, and how long would the search last? In truth, the search for Michael Rockefeller ended as early as November 27, 1961. The Rockefellers returned home, and the Dutch government stated that the young man had most likely drowned or been eaten by sharks. The shark theory does make some sense, since there were a lot of them in those waters. However, reports of them attacking people were very rare. Besides, if Michael had been eaten by a shark, at least some piece of his clothing would probably have been washed ashore, as usually happens in such cases. As for drowning, it also doesn't seem to be the most plausible theory. Michael was an excellent swimmer. The distance from their boat to the shore was about 10 miles or 16 kilometers. It's a lot, but it's not impossible to cross such a distance when you're pumped up on adrenaline and have balloons keeping you afloat. There were considerably freakier versions suggesting that once he swam ashore, he joined some local tribe. This idea was allegedly confirmed by a video made several years after the young Rockefeller's disappearance, where a white man can be seen in a boat with locals. This, however, was common practice among missionaries, who often took part in the rituals conducted by indigenous people. And since the video doesn't show the man's face, it could have been anybody. There's also a theory proposed by journalist Carl Hoffman, who had investigated this case for several years. It states that Michael did indeed make it ashore, but it was killed and eaten by a tribe from the Otsjanup village. And this is a theory I would like to delve into a bit deeper. This version is based on the fact that several days after Michael's disappearance, Dutch missionaries heard of a rumor that had started spreading in the local villages, that several Otsjanup men fished a white fellow out of the river and dealt with him in accordance with the traditions of headhunting, thus avenging their mates that had been murdered by a lepre. At first, the missionaries didn't think of much of this story, but the rumor continued spreading, and soon all the villages on the Asmat territory knew of the pride that the people of Otsjanup took in what they had done. Cornelius van Kassel, one of the missionaries, sent his Asmat assistant Gabriel to find out more about the rumors. Gabriel went to Otsjanup, but the locals grudgingly told him only that they had seen a piece of wood or a snake in the water during those days, and that's it. That's when Gabriel decided to use his cunning. He told them that the authorities knew that Michael was dead, but had no tangible evidence. Maybe the Otsjanup people could help with that. Perhaps they had some of his belongings. But the villagers remained silent. Only one of them showed Gabriel a brand new knife made of human bone. On December 9th, 4 warriors from Otsjanup and the neighboring village of Amasdep came to see Father Hubertus van Pai, another missionary living in Asmat territories. They told him that on November 17th, they were delivering timber to some missionary and on their way back, stopped in the river to smoke. This was when they saw a young white man swimming towards their boat. They looked amicable, but the men in the boat quickly realized that now was their best opportunity to avenge the tribesman that had been killed by whites. They attacked the man with a spear, lugged the body onto their boat, and left. When describing the white man, the warriors mentioned that he was dressed strangely, in shorts without pockets. As you recall, Michael had jumped out of the boat wearing only his trunks. Perhaps that was what the locals took for odd shorts. Michael's body was taken apart by the villagers. The warriors alleged that his skull was hanging in one of their houses. Naturally, they portrayed the whole act as revenge. Since white people have started killing our people, they have given us the right to kill them. White people weren't untouchable anymore. Even the remotest areas and villages heard of this. On December 12th, the information reached the government. Naturally, the authorities didn't want to share such rumors with the public. After all, they had long since banned headhunting and took the whole issue under control when suddenly such an incident comes up. Besides, it's not like there was any tangible evidence. And furthermore, how would they even take the Asmats to court? What laws could they apply? The incident took place on Asmat territory, but the local laws of tribe do not prohibit, but to the contrary encourage revenge and headhunting. Cannibalism is also legal. This is actually a topic for a lengthy discussion. We in the West consider human life to be the greatest value. In our paradigm, nobody can infringe on another person's life, freedom, property, and so on, or at least so I would like to believe. However, this is only our point of view. In these tribes, the moral and legal compass is different. If someone has been killed, their soul will not rest until they are avenged. Peace will only return to the village after another attack and more bloodshed. Van Kassel, the missionary who had caused the stir, was hastily sent home, while his colleague Van Pai was told to keep quiet. Nonetheless, the story ended up in the press. Missionaries sent home letters describing the incident, and their relatives were only too eager to sell those letters to the papers. However, the press gave up on the story rather quickly, most likely due to the interference of the Rockefeller family. The Dutch government sent missionary Wim van de Waal to get more information from the people of Oostgenepe. He befriended them and later on started carefully posing questions about Michael. In a private conversation, several men confessed to headhunting and even showed Wim some bones that allegedly belonged to Michael. This should have been the key to solving the mystery of Michael's disappearance, but when Van de Waal sent the bones to the government, they got lost somewhere along the way. In 2012, Carl Hoffman, the journalist investigating Michael's disappearance, visited Oostgenepe himself. He hoped to find out something new, since the people who were rumored to have killed the young Rockefeller had long since died. The village had definitely given up headhunting at this point. One of the older men told Carl that after Michael was killed in Oostgenepe, a cholera epidemic ravaged the village, killing about 70 people, and the villagers saw this to be revenge for the death of a white man. Rumors of what happened to Michael still circulated through the villages. One evening, Hoffman was spending time in the village watching a local dance from afar. The dance told the story of headhunting. Realizing this was something worth filming, Carl picked up his camera and started recording. But unfortunately, the dance ended quite soon after. Here's what a translator made of the final bit of the dance that was caught on film. The dancers were saying, "Don't you tell this story to any other man or any other village, because this story is only for us. Don't speak and tell the story. I hope you remember it, and you must keep this for us. I hope. This is for you and you only. Don't talk to anyone forever, to other people or another village. If people question you, don't answer. Don't talk to them, because the story is only for you. If you tell it to them, you'll die. I'm afraid you will die. You'll be dead. Your people will be dead if you tell the story. You keep the story in your house, to yourself, I hope forever. After Michael's disappearance, around 500 artifacts that he had procured were exhibited in the now-defunct Museum of Primitive Art. As for the question of what happened to Michael, his father Nelson would answer dryly and laconically, "It's impossible to swim 12 miles." Michael's Rockefeller's disappearance and likely death is not just a story of New Guinea's indigenous tribes, impassable tropical forests, and blood-curdling rituals. It is firstly a story about how a young white man thought himself to be invincible in a place that he should never been in. I would like to end this video, which I hope you have found rather thought-provoking, with a quote from the Dead Birds film. Soon both men and birds will surrender to the night. They'll rest for the life and death of days to come, for each both awaits. But with the difference that men having foreknowledge of their doom bring a special passion to their life. They will not simply wait for death, nor will they bear it lightly when it comes. Instead, they'll try with measured violence to fashion faith themselves. They kill to save their souls, and perhaps to ease the burden of knowing what birds will never know, and what they, as men, who have forever killed each other, cannot forget.